So this is the next step, part two. If you guys were here for the previous session, Anthony talked about how you take an idea for something that you want to build in YUI 3 and kind of start to slowly morph that into something that's going to be a reusable component that you're going to be able to take advantage of in the future, and sort of how you take these ideas and these components and actually build them in YUI 3. So the example that we've been using is a tooltip. Arguably not the most useful thing, but examples need to be simple. This is a talk, not a long class. So again, the sort of stuff that we've covered, where have we been, what did the previous talk go over, real quick, just in case anybody forgot in the last 15 minutes. Started out with simple YUI and just inline JavaScript, the entire body of it right there in the page. Great for prototyping. You make your changes, you can see everything, you can see the DOM that you're starting with, you can see any styles you have, you've got your JavaScript right there. Very easy. Not the most maintainable code, not the most, I would argue, professional code, but a place to start. From there, let's break it out into a script tag. Let's pull it in. Let's take advantage of browsers caching external files. Let's start to kind of separate our presentational foundation or the structure of the page using HTML and the logic that's going to do stuff with it, the JavaScript. From there, started to build a plugin for nodes so that you could get a handle to a node using the built-in YUI selectors, and then apply your plugin to it to turn that into a tooltip. Kind of decorate it with some extra DOM nodes, add some behavior, sort of a cleaner way to add this behavior to already existing elements in the DOM. And from there, a widget. Now, there were some questions about why you would go with a widget versus a plugin in this particular case. Hopefully, I'll be able to convince you guys that for the correct use cases, where for widget makes sense, widgets are awesome. You should be using them. They give you a lot of power and a lot of flexibility. So why even bother continuing on from this? First off, we've got our widget. We can do stuff with it. We can, add more code to the widget to add new behaviors. But maybe that's not the right approach. The cool thing about widgets and plugins in YUI 3 is that they allow you to really build on top of each other and take something that starts out relatively simple and expand it and add in new behaviors. So maybe we should start doing that. Like, where do we go from here if we really want to continue working on it? So we've got the right idea. We've got a widget. Now, widgets are plugin hosts, which means that they can have plugins added to them. They also, as you saw, have attributes, which attributes are great. You get events for free. You get formatters and getters and setters for free. All very useful things. So let's keep it there. Let's not do anything radical. Let's not throw that out. Let's just try and take that widget that we had and kind of distill it down to its barest essence with a little bit of extra stuff in there that allows us to hook into it and add new behaviors and do interesting things with it later on. So, like I was saying, widget provides some structure for you. Anthony covered this, so I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. But widget, since it inherits from base, gives you an initializer and a destructor. The initializer is called when you create a new one after all the chain constructors are called. Destructor is called when you call destroy on it. Allows you to clean up after yourself, make sure that you're not leaving event handlers, that sort of stuff, littering around. So this is a simplified version of what Anthony was doing. We've got an initializer. We do a little bit of work. My version of this works a little bit differently from his, and the reason for that is we're trying to really just do the most basic thing possible for this so that the sort of fancier stuff, the transitions, changing kind of how it looks and stuff, we can add later, but only if we want to. So starting with a simple base is important for that. So what this code is doing is inside the initializer, it's got a node attribute that signifies the node that this widget should do something about. Goes and looks and see, hey, do I have any content? If it does have some if it doesn't have content, rather, it gets the title attribute from the node. And then, like Anthony was saying, we remove the title attribute from the node because we don't want the browser's default tooltip showing up. Something that I'm not showing here and is important, and Luke actually brought this up, is accessibility for this. Titles are important for accessibility on links. You use them to describe what the link is about. Don't copy the content of the link, but you can use them to give screen readers especially, but also in just in regular browser tooltips, more useful information. This destroys that capability. So what's important to do is to use the ARIA support that's in major browsers and add that back in. It's pretty easy. On the node that you're removing the title from, you need to add an aria described by attribute and point that at the ID of the tooltip element that we're replacing the title with. So in this case, it's whatever automatically generated ID YUI3 has given us. Then you also need to set a aria role on the tooltip itself of tooltip, I believe. Luke, is that correct? Yeah. So sorry, I don't have that code in here. I had already done my slides by the time Luke mentioned that, but it is important to bring up that we aren't forgetting accessibility as we're kind of marking up the page and adding more advanced behaviors to it. So Anthony again talked about this. Render UI, draw some UI. For us, we don't actually care. The base widget rendering of an outside bounding box and an inside content box is plenty for us. We just need those two divs. Bind UI, where you bind to the UI. This is where all of your event handler stuff should go inside of a widget. So we're going to do a little bit of work here. What we're going to do is we're going to get a handle to the node that we care about, the node that we're going to mark up or we're going to expand upon with our tooltip, and we're going to listen for mouse enter and mouse leave. Now you could use mouse over, but mouse over kind of sucks, especially for tooltips, because mouse over is going to fire every time you move the mouse over that tooltip. Now we could add in logic to avoid this, but YUI3 has synthetic events. So YUI3 can add Internet Explorer's mouse enter and mouse leave events using those synthetic events. Mouse enter fires once when your mouse enters the target node. Mouse leave fires once when your mouse leaves the node. Very useful. What we're doing here is we're subscribing to those with a function. We're also maintaining our this object, or our context. And we're doing the same thing that Anthony was doing, where we're taking a handle to our outside box and setting it to where the mouse entered it, plus 5 pixels to the right and plus 5 pixels down so we don't cover up the cursor. And then we're calling this.show. So widgets have built-in hide and show functionality. All it does is it adds a class to the widget. It's YUI3-widget name-hidden. Or actually, it's just YUI3-hidden, excuse me. That doesn't have any meaning by default on the page, obviously, because you haven't done anything with that in CSS. It's just a class. Fortunately, when you use widget, it pulls in some very basic widget CSS that gives a meaning to that and sets visibility hidden. So this will bind to the node that we care about, that we want to show the tooltip for, and then show it when you mouse over it, then hide it, again using bind to maintain our context, so this points to what we want it to when you leave it. So the last one is sync UI. This is where you sync up the state of your widget and its attributes to what's actually in the DOM. For us, this is really easy. This looks more complicated than it needs to, and I'm going to get back to why it looks like that a little bit later. But the important part is what's on the inside there in that default function, where we're just getting a handle to the content box and setting the content to the widget's own content attribute. It's pretty simple. It looks a little complicated, especially due to how I had to line break to fit the code on the slide, but why it looks like that will become important in just a couple slides, I promise. Maybe more than a couple. I don't remember the exact order. So now we've got our tooltip. We can create our tooltip. We can tell it that we want it to be hidden by default because tooltip showing by default is weird. Don't do that. We tell it that we want it to render immediately, so we don't need to call .render on it. If you wanted to, say, do something with this widget before it was actually rendered out to the DOM, you could go ahead and not do it that way and instead call render after you've already instantiated it. For us, there's no point. It's not doing anything interesting. Then we're passing it a node attribute. Now, if you'll remember, inside the initializer, if you don't have a content attribute set, it'll look at its node and try and read the title and set that for the content attribute. So we don't have to worry about that. It slurps that up out of the DOM for us automatically. So now what? We've got a really simple tooltip widget. It doesn't do hardly anything. You mouse over a link, it shows. You mouse off the link, it hides. That's it. Plus, it's got kind of a weird sync UI function. So what next? So YUI3 plugins are good for more than just plugging into a node and adding a bunch of behavior to that node. Plugins can plug into all sorts of things, really anything that has been modified or had plugin host mixed into it. So fortunately for us, Widget is a plugin host. Widget can have plugins added. Widget can have plugins removed. So we've got our basic tooltip, but we want it to do more than just be a basic tooltip because that's boring and nobody cares about a basic tooltip. You might argue that nobody cares about a tooltip that does some of the stuff I'm going to show you. That's fair. This is an example for a talk. So let's just go real quick into how you plug in to a widget. It's pretty simple. When you're instantiating the widget, you can set the plugins property. You can pass it either an array of plugin objects, you can pass it a single plugin object, or if you need to specify a configuration for that plugin, you can get more complicated. You can also plug it in after it's been instantiated using tooltip.plug. There's also tooltip.unplug. Those are provided by Widget because, it's got plugin host mixed into it, so those are free. So let's do a really simple plugin into this tooltip widget and kind of see where it takes us and sort of see why maybe we can answer the question of, if we can answer the question of why our sync UI looked goofy. So we're going to create a simple tooltip simple display. You know it's simple because it says simple in the title. That works everywhere. All it's going to do is specify an initializer, get its host object, and listen for the sync event on the host object. When it does that, it calls prevent default just like you might see in the DOM, except this is a custom event. And we can do this because we did some of that strange looking stuff in the sync UI method. And then what we do is we set our own content instead of the default one, and very exciting, we add plus plugin to the end of it. My examples are hard to make super interesting because they're so simple. And then we have to specify a namespace for it because this will be available on the host underneath that namespace. So this is powered by custom events, and that call to prevent default is super important because what that does is it lets us prevent the host's sync UI method from doing what it would normally do and using our own logic inside the plugin. So here's sync UI again, and I added a long comment to explain why it's got that weird syntax. But what we're doing is we're publishing a custom event, sync, from sync UI. And instead of just publishing a custom event and leaving it at that, and then firing it every time we call this function, we set a property on it, and that property is default FN, for default function. This is the function that will be executed when this event is fired and nobody prevents the default action from happening. Just like on a link, if you were to click it, the browser would follow it. That's the default function for the browser on a link. This is our default function for when the sync method is called. It's okay to call this .publish multiple times. YUI3 is smart enough to know that we've already published this and it won't republish it. But you can see at the end, we publish it and immediately call fire. So that way, every time sync UI is called, the sync event will be fired. If there's nobody listening, or if everybody listening doesn't, or if anybody listening calls prevent default, this won't happen. But if there's either nobody listening or nobody prevents the default action will happen. We'll fill in our tooltip with our content attribute. Done. Easy. It's back to the simple widget behavior. So we can take this further, though. A simple display for the tooltip isn't really exciting. You can't do a lot. You're just adding a static string to it. That's kind of boring. Again, don't get your hopes up too high. This is a talk, but we'll do something a little more interesting. So Anthony had the transitions module in his version of the widget and the node plugin and a lot of other stuff. So let's pull that back in now that we've taken it out and used just the default this.show and this.hide functionality offered by the widget. So we're going to create another tooltip. We're going to do the same stuff we were doing before, visible false, render true, select a node, but we're going to add a plugin. This plugin is actually coming from the gallery. I'm not showing a lot of the stuff around it because that's already there. You can use this right now. Just coincidentally, I wrote it and it's got a terrible name, so I'm sorry. It says transition overlay. The gallery name is overlay transition, and it works on any widget, not just overlays. So that was a terrible mistake on my part. However, the important thing to note is that it does work on every widget. What this does is this hooks the show and hide events for widget and replaces them with, instead of just adding the class immediately, we'll fire a transition. So we'll use the transition support in YUI 3.2 Plus to use CSS transitions to show and hide it. These are GPU-powered and browsers that support it, which right now is WebKit. Opera and Firefox support them in their new versions, but it's not in the module yet. So now it's fading in and fading out. I'd show it to you guys, but jumping back and forth doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. None of these things are that hard conceptually to really think about. It fades out and it fades in instead of popping out and popping in. Cool, right? Sure. Still not really all that useful. There's the saying that a broken clock is right twice a day. This clock is so broken it's never right. And that's okay, because we can do more with this. Inside the examples for I/O, I believe, or no, excuse me, the examples for widget on the developer.yahoo.com site, they write a plugin. That plugin's called Widget I/O. What this plugin does is it adds basically a single method to your widget that allows you to make I/O calls. I/O is great. I/O has some limitations, though. You can only call sites on your server, or you can use the crazy Flash cross-domain transfer stuff that gets a little hairy. We don't want to do that, but we want to, say, pull in something more interesting. If we're going to continue using this concept of tooltips for stock quotes, or for stock symbols, rather, wouldn't it be cool if we could pull in quotes? Well, that would be more useful, right? Then we would finally have a tooltip that was worth showing, that didn't just say, hey, this is a stock quote. Not that that doesn't have its place, but it's not very exciting. So the problem with Widget I/O, like I was saying, is that it can only make requests to your local domain. That's a security restriction in the browsers on XML HTTP requests. Sucks, have to deal with it. YQL, on the other hand, provides JSON-P that we can use to go across domains, and YQL is awesome. You guys have probably been to at least one talk about YQL, or at least have heard a little bit about it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But YQL is great, and it's going to let us get this data we need. So let's create a plugin for our widget called Widget YQL. It's going to look similar to Widget I/O. It's going to function just like Widget I/O in that it'll add a method onto the widget that you can call from in the widget or maybe from other plugins that will go out and request some data and bring it back. What we do with that data is kind of up to us. So here's the implementation of Widget YQL minus a couple of things. It's a little scary looking at first, but it's not that bad. We're doing another Y-based create. It's another plugin. We have a sort of fake private variable called _YQL that we're going to use to keep a handle to the YQL request objects that we're going to make. We don't want to have to spin up a new object every time we make a request. If that request isn't going to change, we should just be able to fire that again immediately. So there's no point in doing a new one every time. So let's hang on to it. Inside the initializer, we're going to listen for some of the attributes for this to change. And if they change, we're going to know that, oh, hey, now we have to go back and recreate our YQL object. So that will take care of that. I'm not showing you the attributes because they're not really all that exciting. Query, formatter, config. Query is the YQL query. Formatter is a function callback that gets called when the YQL request returns. Does something useful with the data, because otherwise we just return a JavaScript object, which, okay, that's fine. Hard to write out to the screen in any sort of useful way, at least. Config change is the YQL config that's supported by the YQL module. Shouldn't have to mess with that too much. So whenever that happens, we call our create YQL function, which is just an abstraction around creating a new YQL object, goes and gets those same attributes, and then plugs them into a new y.yql request, which we then store under this.yql. Then here's our send query function that matches up with the API provided by Widget I/O. All that does is allow us to take that YQL request we've created and actually make a request with it, which, that's useful. You might want to do that if you're going to go get the data. So let's go ahead and plug in our tooltip with Widget YQL. For this one, we're going to need some configuration, unfortunately. This plugin can't read your mind yet and know what query you want to make. So you're going to need to tell it what query you're going to want to make to YQL. And then we get back into this formatter function that I mentioned that needs to do something interesting with this YQL data that you've gotten back, because a JavaScript object, again, not very useful for a tooltip, especially the ones that come back from YQL. If you've seen them, they're like 8 levels deep before you get any real data you care about. So we're going to go through, get the data we care about, call up to our host, and set the content to the last trade price only, which is a field which is the last trade price for this particular YQL query that we made asking for financial data on whatever the host object's stock quote was. And then for fun, we're going to fire a YQL response with the results. This isn't strictly necessary, but it's good to do. It's useful for other people that may want to use this widget, or this plugin for your widget, excuse me. So you guys just saw how much configuration went into that widget YQL, unfortunately. Every time you want to plug it into, let's say, a new tooltip, you're going to have to define the query you want to send and what you want to do with the data when you get it back. That sucks. Repeating yourself sucks. Copying and pasting code sucks. You make mistakes. It happens to everybody. Let's try and avoid that if we can. So now it's important to remember that plugins are just full JS objects. They can do whatever they want. They follow a structure. Certain methods are called at certain times, and they have specific attributes on them that come from being a plugin. They can reference this.getHost. They have any attributes you might have defined, that sort of thing. So wouldn't it be nice if we could do something more interesting with a plugin than just a really dumb one that we have to configure every time? What if we could do plugins on top of plugins? Now, this image doesn't seem super related until you notice this guy down here. So if we were to use the metaphor of the tooltip as the couch, here'd be some plugins. They're sitting on top of that plugin. So there's no reason that a plugin can't look at its host and plug that host in with another plugin. It sounds a little wacky. I'm not actually sure that the YUI team recommends this, but for this specific use case, it's pretty useful. Because what we can do is we can create a simple plugin, let's call it, I don't know, tooltip YQL, that requires widget YQL, and then make sure to plug the host with widget YQL right when it initializes. So that way we know that the host tooltip object now can send queries out to YQL. We don't have to necessarily have all that information inside this plugin. This plugin stays very small, and widget YQL is still useful for other people because we've abstracted out that content and that behavior. So we're going to do a couple things. Set up the widget YQL on the host. We're going to listen for a couple of events on the host so that we know when we want to send a query. When the host fires that YQL response event, we're going to listen for it and call sync UI. Now, if we had any other plugins on this host that were maybe listening for that sync event that sync UI fired, preventing the default and doing their own thing, well, that might be kind of useful. So there's no reason that you can't plug a host with multiple plugins. Like we just showed that here. We had a plugin plug a plugin into the host. That starts to get hard to explain. So it's pretty easy to add multiple plugins to a host. Remember I mentioned that you could pass an array. Well, there you go. So we're going to do our transition overlay so that it hides and shows in a pretty way instead of just popping in and out because, well, who doesn't want their code and their stuff to look pretty? Tooltip YQL, which is actually kind of a thin wrapper around widget YQL that's so. And then tooltip display, which is going to take that or listen for the host sync event, cancel it because the host default behavior is sort of stupid, and do something more interesting with that data that we got back from widget YQL with the stock quotes. So we've now plugged in our host with 4 plugins. It's got all these extra behaviors on it. Great, we're done. It works. I went and tested it in my browser. I would, but jumping back and forth isn't going to be all that interesting. So not quite. If we're keeping track of this in the grand scheme of from idea to widget, we've taken this idea and we've brought it up to a widget, and now we've talked about how to mix in new behaviors to it. This is starting to get a little complicated, especially when you have plugins adding plugins to the plugin's host. See, again, sounds really weird when you say it out loud, but it's, it sort of makes sense. So maybe we should have some way of knowing that this worked. So let's prove it works. Let's write some tests for it. Now, I'm not going to go through this too much or too deeply because I assume a lot of you guys have seen YUI tests before. Actually, could we get a show of hands so I know how fast I should go through this? All right, going to take it a little slow. So Nicholas talked about YUI test a little bit yesterday. Unfortunately, he didn't really get into too many details about how it works or how you set them up. He was talking much bigger picture about where YUI test is going, which is awesome, but you guys should probably know how to use it before you know whether or not you should care where it's going. So what's great about YUI test is that we can use it both for unit testing of library code that we may have or for even some simple functional tests. And I'm going to show that here so that you guys have some idea. So first let's come up with the most simple test we can think of. Again, giving a talk, want to keep it easy. And also sometimes these things are good to make sure you haven't done anything really stupid. That was a worthless slide, sorry. So here's our simple test. What this test is going to do is it's going to make sure that we can take the base tooltip and render it and not throw any JavaScript errors. So that's going to make sure that we've set up all of our dependencies right in the loader. It's going to make sure that we don't have any syntax errors because if any of this code throws an error, YUI test will tell us that our test failed. And so that's all this does, is it sets up a tooltip. It doesn't do anything with that tooltip. It doesn't interact with the tooltip beyond providing it kind of a framework around it to make sure it doesn't explode. And as you can see, setting this up, not very hard. We define a new y.test case. This is after pulling in test, by the way. I've left out the loader stuff, but that is important to keep in mind. We've given our test case a name. Again, simple, so we know it's simple because everything named simple is simple, right? Yes, and easy. And then we're defining a test case here. Now, this is using the more verbose test case naming support in there because just doing camel case all the way across is impossible to read, for me at least. So tooltip should render without errors. So we're going to try exactly what we said. We're going to try and render a tooltip and cross our fingers, no errors. When that test is done and we've finished defining it, we're going to close out the test case, we're going to add it to the test runner, and then we're going to run our tests. You guys are going to have to take my word for it, since I'm not showing the live code right now, that test passes. Or it did, at least. So good, we didn't do anything too dumb. We can write JavaScript without putting in syntax errors, and a tooltip that, at least from a base JavaScript level does something. And notice the yet there, that's important. Again, not very useful though. Kind of like a spork with tines that short would be really unuseful. So how could we add more utility to this? Well, what's the base thing that a tooltip should really do? Arguably, the base thing that a tooltip should do is when you hover over whatever link the tooltip is decorating, it should show up. If a tooltip doesn't show up, what was the point? Now, where it shows up isn't terribly important. That would be another test. But let's just make sure that it does show up. And to do that, we're going to need some help. Because unfortunately, with a base YUI test, you are not going to be able, or you're not going to want to make it wait, or have it go and spin it in an infinite loop and really quickly mouse over the link, have the tooltip show up, and then have the test check to make sure that the tooltip showed up. That's not going to scale at all, and nobody wants to run tests across 6 different browsers, 7 different browsers by mousing over a link. So let's do some event simulating. Let's have JavaScript and the YUI event system pretend that we moused over the link so that we can then check to see, hey, if somebody was going to mouse over that link, would the tooltip show up? So you need to pull in event simulate, node event simulate. I forget the actual one. It's in the docs. But we're going to set up another test case, a lot like the one we set up before. This time, tooltip should show on mouse enter. We're actually going to simulate mouse over because mouse enter is a synthetic event in browsers that aren't IE, not terribly important. Again, we create our tooltip. Works the same as the 5 previous times you guys saw it, so not going to show it again. But we're going to get a handle to the link that the tooltip is decorating and pretend that the user moused over it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to assert that that tooltip should be visible. Widgets have a visible property on them. It's true when they're visible, false when they're not visible. You could make this a much more complicated check to see if it was actually visible by checking the styles on it. We're not getting into that. And then here's the error that we would say if the tooltip wasn't visible. We would tell you that the tooltip wasn't visible. That's kind of important because then you can know why your test failed if it's not just a JavaScript error. So cool. Now we don't have to mouse over the link. We can run this test in 2, 6, 8, 15 different browsers. It's going to do the same thing every time, and we'll be able to check at a glance, did our test pass, does our base tooltip work? So that's great for stuff where you do it and it happens immediately. Unfortunately, in JavaScript, there's a lot of places where you're going to see asynchronous behaviors, specifically when you're calling out to external resources, but there can be other stuff too, even just dealing with events. And this is what this is going to handle. Now, these basic tests are just running in a line straight down. They're not waiting for anything to happen. And to do that, we're going to need to build a more complicated test. Fortunately, YUI test can do that for you. It's got 2 methods in it that are very useful that you can use inside of a test case to allow you to test things that don't happen right away. This.wait, which makes the test stop and wait. You define how long you want it to wait. You can either have it wait a specific amount of time and then immediately call a function, or you can just have it wait for some specified period of time. If you don't do anything before that timer runs out, your test fails. So the other half of that is this.resume. So inside, let's say, your event subscription that's waiting for something to happen, you call this.resume. And then you test your conditions to see if the test passed or failed. So this way you can do stuff like pull in content from external sources. Or maybe you've got a tooltip and you've plugged in the transition plugin for it, so now it hides and shows not immediately, but on 250 milliseconds or a quarter of a second. Well, you couldn't test that right away using the basic test that we've shown before. That's not going to work. You're going to check and see if it's visible. it's not actually going to be visible yet, your test is going to fail. So let's test with that transition plugin and use an async test. So, the first part, setting up our test, giving it a name so that we can read it. Second part, setting up the tooltip. Still very basic, except we're plugging in the transition overlay stuff, which, again, doesn't only work on overlays and has 3 different names because I'm an idiot. But we're going to skip this part here for now and go down to tooltip.show, which is where we start the tooltip actually appearing. Remember, this is on a 1/4 second delay. JavaScript happens very fast. So immediately, we're then going to wait for a second. Now, what's happening up here is we're using that plugin's namespace, that NS that we kept seeing, and it was kind of like, well, what the hell is that for? This is what that's for. So we can talk to that tooltip widget, and we know that the transition plugin is available on the transition plugin namespace, because that's what it's set up with, and call onEnd. So when that transition's done, this event handler is going to fire. It gets passed a single value, whether or not it was transitioning to visible or not visible. So then what we do is we call this.resume to start our test back up again. Pass it a callback function, and then we're going to assert that, hey, the transition said that it was transitioning to visible, and hey, is the tooltip actually visible? And again, with the super complicated what broke, the tooltip wasn't visible. So that's a really simple use case for this sort of async testing, but it's also very powerful because you can then test complicated behaviors and complicated event-driven applications using YUI test without having to do any sort of crazy nonsense to make it work. So far, hard to see because you haven't been able to see these in the full context of a page, but these have all been written out as a single page. Again, just like back to the simple YUI and inline JavaScript of the very first version of the tooltip that Anthony talked about, these are some HTML content, your head, your body, then a script tag that defines the test and runs the test. That's great for prototyping out a test. Very quick to keep running it, very little code to keep track of in your head, super nice and segmented. As soon as you want to test anything more than a single feature or run a single test inside of a test case, this is not helpful at all. So there's a better way to organize this stuff. Let's scale it up so that we can test multiple tests inside of a test case. If you want to go really crazy, we can go all the way out to test suites, which is a container for multiple test cases, which is a container for multiple tests. So that's how granular or not granular you can make it if you care about. But let's break this out into a YUI module. I'm not showing the wrapping stuff around it. I assume you guys have seen that stuff before. Let's pretend that this is YUI.add advanced tests. So what we're going to do, same thing we've done before, we're going to define a test case. We're going to give it a name. These setup and teardown functions are new, though, and they become especially valuable when you're running multiple tests inside of a test case. What you do with these is setup runs before every test, teardown runs after every test. They have access to the same context object, or this object, that the test has, so you can set something up, stuff it into this, and then the test can use it. In this case, every single one of these tests is going to require a tooltip. We know that. We're testing tooltip. That makes sense. We don't want to have to repeat our tooltip setup code 4 times or more as we do some real tests that aren't just examples. So let's do it up in the setup. We know that'll be called before every individual test. That saves us a lot of work. But then it's important that after each test, inside teardown, we get rid of that tooltip. We don't want the previous state of the tooltip influencing any more of these tests. We want these tests to test the smallest unit of functionality they can to make sure that they're not giving us bad results. And then you can just define multiple tests. It works just like you would expect, setting string properties on an object literal. Give them lots of names. So here's the test that we showed. Here's another test that I didn't show, but works a lot like the tooltip test, where you've got the YQL plugin and you're using an asynchronous test to wait until the response from YQL comes back and then shove that in there and make sure that the data showed up. So we've now got a tooltip widget. It's nice, it's clean, it's small. We've got a lot of plugins that add more advanced behaviors to it. Arguably, it's of arguable usefulness at this point in time, but it is something that we think is nice. We're using it on our sides. Hey, maybe we should share it. The YUI gallery is the place for that. You've got tests for it, which is great, because now when Carity launches his gallery dashboard, whatever thing it was that he showed last night, that automatically runs all the tests for your gallery module, you can say, hey, look, my gallery module passes all of its tests. I know this is good code. I've written tests for it. And you've been meaning to share more anyways, right? Everybody should be sharing. that just me? Anyways. So this is coming in a little short because I'm super nervous, but this is one way to flesh out an idea and take it from a rough idea that you prototype just right there in the page to a full-fledged widget with a lot of power there that you can then add plugins to that are adding all these more complicated behaviors that really make it from kind of, ho-hum, not very interesting, to something that people might actually want to use. With this basic tooltip widget, you add some plugins, it can now show and hide nicely. It changes the content that it displays. What we showed was just a basic string, but you could easily extrapolate that out to injecting actual HTML. Maybe it would be nice if it showed some stock charts or a little Spark graph of what the stock's done over the last 30 days. I was actually working on that before the talk, but I couldn't get it working in time, unfortunately. YUI charts is still a little rough around the edges for anybody that was curious. The important thing to note is that this isn't the only way that you could do this. There's other ways that you could take this. You could create a big base widget that does all of this stuff and uses configuration attributes to switch between it or to enable or disable features. I wouldn't recommend it. You absolutely could do it that way. You could do this a way that I haven't even ever even thought of. There's a million different ways to do things in JavaScript. There's not necessarily one right way. This is a way that I'm pretty happy with. The plugging plugins into the host gets a little crazy, but it's kind of a cool idea that I haven't found a use case for until this talk. I've got some ideas for that in the future, though, so it might be something worth investigating. And that's it.